by the Senate and people of Rome. In theory, he now controlled the whole empire, but in practice he was only master of its western half. Unlike the Danube legions and the British legions, who both at this point backed Severus, the troops in Syria and Egypt recognized Pescennius Niger's claim to the throne, and would have scoffed at any attempt by Severus to order them around. There were high hopes all around, though, that political tensions between East and West could be resolved without bloodshed, but it was not to be. The basic fact was that Severus was convinced that he had every right to the throne, and Niger was also convinced that he had every right to the throne. Keeping the aftermath of Julianus's rise and fall bloodless meant that one of the two generals was going to have to back down and take a subordinate role to the other. Claudius Albinus had already allowed himself to be so subordinated, but neither Niger nor Severus had any intention of following his example. And so, unfortunately, civil war. But Severus was savvy about optics, as evidenced by the care he took in keeping his initial coup a bloodless one. Well, relatively bloodless. Julianus and the men who had murdered Pertinax were dead, but no one liked them anyway, so they don't really count. In all his public posturing, Severus intimated that Niger was his friend and colleague, and that they couldn't possibly have any real quarrel with one another, since they were such good friends and such good colleagues. Their two armies had both acted nobly in rejecting Julianus and independently hailing their leader's emperor, but now that Pertinax was avenged, it was time for them to act nobly again and reject discord in favor of concord. Despite his public front of hopeful hope and friendly friendship, though, Severus and his lieutenants were diligently preparing for war. They well knew that, barring a miracle, the only place Severus and Niger would be able to conclusively settle the issue of who was emperor would be on the battlefield. Thus, 30 days after he arrived in Rome, Severus ordered his forces to break camp and head east. He told the Senate and the people that he was merely on his way to tour and inspect the eastern provinces, and pointedly made no mention of Niger or his rival claim to power. But those in the know knew that Severus was on his way to demand the approaching Syrian legions recognize him as their emperor or face destruction. We know basically how things are going to turn out in contests between Severus and Niger, and we'll get to the details in a second. But before we get into the particulars, I should point out that things didn't have to turn out this way. Indeed, to many at the time, the ascension and subsequent victories of Severus came as quite a shock. And see, a pretty good chunk of the political class simply assumed that the job was naturally going to pass over to Pescennius Niger. From the moment Julianus bought the throne, they expected Niger, not Severus, to be the man who would ride triumphantly into the city, cow the Praetorians, and restore order. All the Syrian governor had to do was get on his horse and ride. But then a funny thing happened. The presumed successor to Julianus never showed up for his coronation ceremony. There's not a ton in the historical record about Pescennius Niger, but we do know that he was born in the late 130s AD, round about the time that power was being transferred from Hadrian to Antoninus, making him the eldest of our three claimants to the throne. Like Severus, he had come from an upper-middle-class family of equites, and, also like Severus, saw his career advance rapidly during that age of upward mobility, made possible by the Parthian War, the Marcomannic Wars, and the Antonine Plague. Early in Commodus's reign, he had been made a senator, and then appointed to a military command in Dacia, where he served alongside Claudius Albinus and helped settle a brief Sarmatian uprising. After that, he was enough in Commodus's confidence that it was Niger who was ordered into Gaul to put the rebel army down. Probably as a reward for his success in this endeavor, Commodus appointed Niger to the all-important governorship of Syria. Arriving in Antioch, he endeared himself to the population by taking a liberal attitude towards local custom, and for encouraging the kind of games Marcus had outlawed, and endeared himself to the legions by maintaining discipline without being overly harsh or strict about anything. He remained happily situated in Syria until the chaos of 193 led him to pack up his things and lead his armies toward Rome. Very slowly pack up his things, and very slowly lead his armies toward Rome. Not to Rome, mind you, just toward Rome. He never would get there. The problem with Niger, and the thing that most especially led to his fall, was the fact that he did not feel the fierce urgency of now. When Septimius Severus decided to make his bid for the throne, he spent every waking moment preparing to march on Rome, and when preparations were complete, he spent every waking moment actually marching on Rome, and when he arrived, he spent every waking moment figuring out exactly how he was going to keep the power he had grabbed. Pescennius Niger, on the other hand, was far more lackadaisical about everything. Given a more vigorous response, he might have, like Vespasian before him, leveraged his position as de facto leader of the Eastern Empire into de jure leader of the whole empire. But he dillied and he dallied, and when he finally got around to making his move, it was too late. 2 months had passed since the death of Julianus, and Niger was just now barely leaving Antioch. He wouldn't even make it to the Hellespont before being met by Severus's Danube legions, who, in the same amount of time, had marched from Pannonia to Rome, ousted Julianus, sat around for a bit catching their breath as Severus planned their next move, and then crossed the Adriatic, marched across Macedonia and Thrace, all the way to the Hellespont. It is quite obvious, then, which general was feeling said fierce urgency of now, and which was feeling the fierce urgency of whenever. Up until the very end, Severus and Niger maintained an officially friendly correspondence that pretended war was not imminent. But finally, the charade was called off when the two armies met in battle, seeing as how it's kind of hard to pretend you have nothing but the most peaceful of intentions when you're simultaneously ordering your cavalry in to ride and hack your rival to pieces. The advance guards of both armies found each other in the province of Bithynia and fought two separate engagements in the late summer of 193, which, though too large to be considered skirmishes, were also too small to be decisive. In both fights, though, Niger's eastern troops looked badly overmatched against the veteran Pannonian legions and were beaten handily. The ascension of Niger, which at first had seemed so right, so logical, and so inevitable, was now turning out to be so very clearly a pipe dream. Winter overtook the contest, though, and when the new year dawned, Severus cemented his alliance with Albinus by sharing a consulship with the British general. He further let it be known that while he was prosecuting the war in the east, that he fully trusted Albinus to maintain the peace and tranquility of the west. His other rival now fully complacent, Severus wasted no time trying to land the final blow against Niger when spring arrived. In the meantime, Niger had withdrawn his forces almost all the way back to Syria, and had set up a fortified position near the village of Issus, at a location known as the Cilician Gates, a narrow east-west passage wedged in between the southern coastline of Turkey and the sharply rising Taurus Mountains to the north. When you Google the Battle of Issus, though, your first hits will not point you to the decisive battle between Severus and Niger, but rather to the decisive battle between Alexander the Great and the Persians, fought over 500 years earlier on exactly the same spot. But Niger, as they say, was no Alexander. Though the two forces were roughly equal in size, 3 legions apiece plus some auxiliaries, the Danube troops, tempered in the fires of the Marcomannic Wars, were simply superior to the Syrian troops, who had been tempered in the fires of, well, not much really. The Parthian War was already 30 years past, and as a result, none of the soldiers in the east had any real experience with any real fighting. Niger's men made a go of it, but they were already beginning to fall back when Severus's cavalry, sent around on a secret mission prior to the battle, suddenly appeared at their rear. Chaos and slaughter ensued, and Niger was forced to flee the battlefield. His army now completely destroyed, the Syrian governor was apparently making for Parthia, where he hoped to find asylum and perhaps the resources to make another bid for the throne one day. But he was caught before he reached the Euphrates, and like Julianus before him, was unceremoniously beheaded. The head was sent back to Severus, who forwarded it on to the smallish but well-fortified city of Byzantium, where what was left of the Niger loyalists had holed up. Though their leader's head now sat atop a spike in front of the city gates, Niger's remaining lieutenants obstinately refused to surrender. At first, they held out simply to refuse Severus the satisfaction of victory, but eventually, they came to believe that Claudius Albinus would eventually heed the various calls for him to get into the ring, and that maybe, just maybe, they could live long enough to see Severus's head on a spike too. But after a 2-year holdout, famine got the better of them, and the last of Niger's soldiers finally surrendered Byzantium in 196. Severus ordered all the walls and fortifications of the city be toppled, reducing Byzantium to just another open village, which is exactly how Constantine found it more than a century later. In between the occupation and surrender of Byzantium, Severus busied himself in the east. Still hoping to maintain some thin veneer of clemency, Severus did not simply go around to the various provinces killing those leading men who had supported Niger, but he did do the next harshest thing he could think of. Anyone associated with the fall was purged from political office and their property confiscated. The ill-gotten, but not murderously so, gains were then directed by Severus to his faithful soldiers. The soon-to-be undisputed emperor had no illusions about where his power was derived from, and no desire to beat around the bush in his plans to hold on to that power. For the entirety of the Severan dynasty, starting with Severus himself, it would be the army first, last, and always. Indeed, as he lay dying, he gave his sons one last piece of advice, summing up his whole political philosophy in one short sentence. Be harmonious with each other, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all other men. Severus's position was crystallizing, but since you can't return home to a triumph if your victory comes against your fellow Romans, literally, it was against the rules, Severus embarked on a brief campaign against the Parthians to give himself a nice foreign victory to point to. Following a series of practically non-contested victories in the Parthian borderlands beyond the Euphrates, Severus was finally confident enough in his grasp on power that he decided to drop the pretense that he was going to make Albinus his heir and announced that his young son Caracalla was now to be known as Marcus Aurelius Septimius Bassianus Antoninus and would be next in line for the throne. This news came as something of a nasty surprise to Albinus in Britain, whose support for Severus, after all, had been premised on being named Severus's heir. The announcement also put an incident from the previous year in a new light. After defeating Niger, Severus had sent a note to Albinus proclaiming the triumph, but when the messengers arrived and requested a private audience with Albinus, they had whipped out daggers and tried to kill him. The assassination attempt had been unsettling, but it had also been difficult to believe, based on every other thing he had ever said or done, that Severus had been the one who ordered the attack. But now that Albinus was getting the old double-cross, the random assassination attempt by some rogue soldiers took on a much more sinister light, because Severus had obviously tried to kill him. In 196, now fully aware that he had been duped into complacency for the last 2.5 years, Albinus finally accepted all that his troops wanted him to accept. He allowed himself to be hailed Imperator, kept the name Caesar, and prepared himself for war with Severus. He crossed over the English Channel into Gaul with 3 legions and a host of auxiliaries, that Cassius Dio estimated to be some 150,000 total men.